Hello and welcome to part 2 of the S1 workshop. This part of the workshop focuses on percentages work. The S1 course in St Ninians is completely non-calculator and the vast majority of the S2 course is also non-calculator. So initially in S1 any percentages work that we would do would be without the use of a calculator, and then we do go on and extend them into a little bit of calculator work in S2. However, it wouldn't really be until S3 when we would spend more time working out percentages on a calculator. So any work that you do at home with your child on percentages, if you could encourage non-calculator calculations, that would be absolutely brilliant, because that's what we would be encouraging in class. Most children do come into St Ninians with a little background on percentages, and we start off kind of trying to gently remind them about what they should know from primary. One of the things that they would have worked on in primary school would be taking a common percentage and turning it into a common fraction, and the link between the percentage and the fraction often makes it much easier to do some of the percentage calculations that we look at in S1. We would always teach pupils to break them down into easier, more manageable parts, and the percentages you see on the screen would hopefully be fairly recognisable to the pupils and familiar. Out of the ones on the screen at the moment, I would say probably 33 1/3% would be lesser known as a third, and possibly 5% as 1/20. However, we do spend a wee bit of time thinking about 5%, and that's something I'll come to a little bit later on in the presentation. Another common one which we would encourage in S1, if they hadn't seen before, would be for 66 2/3%. And again, we would encourage pupils to recognise that as 2/3 as a common fraction. But most of these they will have spent time on in primary school already, and it would just be a very quick reminder at the beginning of the topic. For those pupils that hadn't spent much time on percentages work in primary school, we would go right back to the beginning, show them why 10% is 1/10, 20% is a fifth, etc., and spend a lot of time on the numeracy behind that before applying it to a question about finding a percentage of an amount. We would start with multiples of 10, and for some pupils that would be the easiest way to get started with any percentage. And again, some pupils find 10% kind of tends to be their starting point for most questions, even if they do have another common fraction, just because division by 10 really is easy for them. So we would begin with whole numbers, hopefully trying just to build up their confidence a little bit. 10% is quite a straightforward starting point, so we would expect them to show working throughout. So they would find for 10% of 80, they would recognise that as 1/10 of 80. And we would already know, or we would have taught prior to working on the percentages topic, that 1/10 is division by 10. So the pupils would take the 80, divide by 10 and get 8. That would allow them a nice gentle start. We would find 10% of a lot of different values, some whole, some decimal, some that give whole number answers and some that give decimal answers as well, and start to build up their confidence from there. Once we'd firmly established that 10% is 1/10 and that's division by 10, we would then look at multiples of 10%. So in this case, for example, where we want to find 30% of 160, the first thing we would encourage would be to find 10% of 160. Again, using the same method above, so that would be 1/10 of 160. They would then find 160 divided by 10, giving an overall answer of 16. Then what we would try to do is build up the relationship between 10% and 30%, and having them realise that 10%, there are 3 10% making up 30%, so we would simply take our final answer here and multiply it by 3. So 30% of 160 we would get by multiplying the 16 by 3, giving an overall answer of 48. can do that for lots of different multiples of 10. Again, some of them have other common fractions as well, like 50%, however, and 20%. However, at this stage, working with 10% would be a good start, and to let them see that that's a possibility, regardless of what kind of number they're finding a fraction of, because some numbers, for example, if you were going to find 20%, 20% they would recognise as 1/5. However, if numbers don't kind of easily divide by 5, that can put some pupils off, whereas they tend to be able to make a good start with 10% and take it from there. If you want to just pause the video, have a little try at 40%, and then I'll put the solution up in a second. Okay, so in this case, again, for 40%, we would start with 10% of 120 as 120 divided by 10, giving an answer of 12. Again, we would want the pupil to link 10% to 40 by multiplication by 4. So they take the answer they got for 10%, multiply it by 4, and they end up with an overall 48. Again, sometimes it is easier just to use fractional equivalents as well, depending on the number that we have. So in this case, for example, 25% we would recognise as 1/4. And again, I would encourage the pupil to have a look at the number that they're trying to find a quarter of and see, is it nicely divisible by 4? If not, and that's potentially going to cause them to run into some trouble, then again there are other options there. However, in this case, this number does divide nicely by 4, so we could start off taking 25% of 84 being 1/4 of 84, and they would understand by that point that finding 1/4 is division by 4, and that would give us 21. Okay, now we're just trying to build up a little toolkit for later on, so there are a number of different options open to them, and they can select the one that makes them most comfortable. And fractional equivalents tend to be, for some pupils, also an easier go-to than other methods. Same idea at the bottom. So we have 20% of 525. That would be recognisable to pupils as 1/5 of 525, and they could go and find 20% quite easily. So again, if you want to pause the video, and then we can have a look at a solution. Okay, so again here we would have 20% of 525 changed into 1/5 of 525. Pupils would know to find 1/5 that we divide by 5, and that would give us 105. Now, 15% is probably a percentage that some of them are not as comfortable with. They maybe haven't worked with very often in primary school, but 15% we would encourage them to calculate by breaking it down into 10% and then a 5%. Now, again, 5% has its own fraction. However, there is a nice way to find it knowing 10%. So we would start off by suggesting that they find 10% of 260 in the same way as shown before. So that's the same as 1/10 of 260, which would be 260 divided by 10, and that's 26. Now, it would be important as well at this point to try to form a link between 10% and 5%. And again, we would spend a wee bit of time discussing in class that to find 5%, we would just half the value we already had for 10%. So 5% is just half of this value, which means we would find half of 26, and that would give us the value of 5%. So 5% in this case of 260 would be the 26 divided by 2, and that would be 13. Then all we're looking to do is to add these two percentages here together to get 15%, and therefore if we take the value of 10% and 5% and add them up, then that would give us an overall 15%. So 15% of 260 would just be 26, the plus the 13, and that's 39. Now, in some texts, textbooks, worksheets, some materials that are just out there from before, 17.5% was a really common question or a common percentage to be asked because of previous tax rates. I still don't think it's a bad skill to have, being able to find 17.5%, just because it is straightforward when you break it down to 10%, 5% and 2.5%. And it's one that pupils maybe find a wee bit tricky upon first sight. And then when we give them the tools to break it down, it's not as difficult after that. And it maybe also fosters the idea of finding quick, easy ways to find a percentage with a pupil, thinking outside the box rather than trying to make life difficult for themselves. So again, we could start here by finding 10% of 480, and we would do so by doing 480 divided by 10, by finding 1/10, and that would be 48. We've already built up the idea of 5% being half of that value. So for 5% of 480, we're going to take half the value of the previous percentage. So half of 10% is 5%. So if we take the 48 and divide it by 2, we get 24. And that's our new value for 5%. And then 2.5% compares to 5% as it's also half. So we half the value we found here, and that gives us 2.5% of 480. And again, that's working with the 24. Half the 24 gives us 12. And these three values here are the ones that we're going to work with to get 17.5, because 10% add 5% add 2.5% gives us an overall total of 17.5%. And we're going to get that by adding the 48, the 24 and the 12. And that's 84. Okay. Now, once we get out of the initial stages of building up all the different methods that we have, encouraging pupils to work with common fractions or starting with 10% as a basis, then the next thing to do would be to kind of move away and try to have pupils working into maybe non-common fractions, non-common percentages. So something like 35%, for example, isn't really a common percentage, it's not a common fraction. And really we would have different ways to do this type of question. So there's a number of ways that they could go about this. And really, once they have the tools to do so, there's no right or wrong answer as long as what they use is mathematically sound. So one possible option would be to find 10%, multiply that by 3 to give 30%, and add a 5% into that as well, which they would also know by finding half of the 10%. That's one method. A second method would be to start off by finding 1%. Now again, we would maybe spend a lesson working on calculations of numbers where you find 1% and scale up to anything else that you like, and 1% being dividing by 100, because percent means per 100, so 1% is 1 out of 100. So once they knew 1%, they could just multiply that by 35, and that would give them 35%. Depending on the numbers in the question, pupils multiplying by 35, if it had to be decimal multiplication or long multiplication, that may or may not be something that they are comfortable with. So again, there are other options out there. Finally, another option would maybe be to find a 10% and a 25% and then add those together, and that would give the 35. Again, it would depend, I suppose, on whether the 25%, which is a quarter, was nicely, if it was nicely divisible by 4, the number that you wanted to find the percentage of. If it wasn't, and again pupils weren't comfortable with the numeracy involved in the calculation they've been asked to do, then again that's not always something that they would need to do. So there are other options out there, of course. The pupils will always come up with their own suggestions, and those are just some of the ones that we would look at and talk about in class. hope you found this video useful. We would hope to put some more out there to help you as well. And in the meantime, if you could give us a follow at St Ninian's Maths on Twitter, we would be very grateful.